The summer light at the marine lab smelled of salt and lamp oil, and that smell would follow Roger Arliner Young for the rest of her life. Roger Arliner Young was born into a small house where coal dust lived in the seams of the floorboards, and the air always tasted faintly of the boiler. She arrived in Clifton Forge, Virginia, and her family soon moved to Burgettstown, Pennsylvania, where she learned early that the world was measured in hard work and the careful keeping of small things. Her father worked in the mines. Her mother cleaned other people's houses. Money was a quiet thing in their home, folded thin and hidden. But attention was abundant. As a child, she watched ants line up along the garden wall. She watched the way light pooled on the edge of a teacup. Those small attentions became the first lessons of a scientist: notice, name, and do not rush past what is alive and moving. School felt like a doorway. The classrooms had cold radiators and the chalk smell that belongs to many small towns. Roger read music and could find patterns and rhythm. She could have followed a different path. Instead, a single science class at Howard University opened another map entirely. The lab was a place of lamps and glass. The wooden benches were polished by many hands. When she first put her eye to a microscope, she felt the physical tilt of wonder, tiny shapes beating and shifting, like a whole hidden ocean in a drop of water. The sound of a pipette felt to her like a metronome. She learned to steady her hands. She learned to write down what she saw with clear, patient sentences. Her route to scholarship was not smooth. At Howard, she did not glide through classes. She failed a few courses. She worked to support her family and carried the worry of a mother in poor health. Yet she found a steadying presence in the young, exacting biologist Ernest Everett Just, who taught at Howard and who would become a mentor and collaborator. Under his guidance, she learned methods of marine biology, how to collect eggs from sea urchins, how to keep them alive under a lamp, how to wait with experiments until the answer chose to show itself. Her summers at the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole were full of the sound of waves and the hiss of aquaria. There she practiced the careful, slow labor that research demands, hours of watching, of tiny adjustments, of the particular sorrow of an experiment that will not behave. In 1924, while still a young researcher and not yet famous beyond her small circle, Roger published a short but precise piece in Science about the excretory apparatus of the paramecium. The paper's wording was lean and calm. It read like someone who had learned to make sentences hold only what they needed to hold. That short publication mattered in two ways. It announced her presence to the scientific world, and it showed how a steady eye could find meaning in minuscule movement. When that article appeared, it carried the extra weight of being written by a black woman at a time when neither race nor gender made such feats easy to accept. The sensation of triumph was bittersweet. The paper proved she could contribute to knowledge, but few doors opened afterward. Her path afterward was a series of small victories braided with larger setbacks. She earned a master's degree at the University of Chicago, and later persisted until she earned a Ph.D. in zoology at the University of Pennsylvania in 1940. That doctorate came not as a single blaze of glory, but as the end point of years of returning, of failing qualifying exams and trying again, of losing positions and finding teaching posts at schools where resources were scarce but students were hungry. She taught at Howard and at several historically black colleges and universities. She assisted with experiments at Woods Hole. She endured rumors and gossip, and at times the institutional decisions of the day felt like doors closing for reasons that had little to do with her ability. Yet she kept coming back to the bench, where a petri dish and a lamp could offer a clearer measure of her worth than whispered talk. There were moments of humor and warmth amid the strain. Colleagues remembered Roger's stubborn love for small jokes when a long day of pipetting had everyone's patience frayed. She had a private laugh she kept for herself, the way a small victory in the lab could taste sweeter than any public accolade. But there were also times when fear tightened her chest, the fear that grants would not come, that prejudice would blunt a career, that the care of an ailing mother would consume her. Later in life, she faced deep frustrations and periods of mental distress that colored her final years. It is a reminder that talent alone does not shield us from the world's cruelties. Aside, a small reflective beat, patience and observation is not only a scientific method, it is a way to live. The slow gathering of facts and the gentle correction of error teach humility. They teach that truth often arrives in small increments, not in grand statements. This was a lesson Roger learned by watching eggs under lamps, and by returning to work after defeat. Her early life had both the texture of poverty and the scent of laboratory lamps. It had the triumph of a short paper in science and the bitter aftertaste of a world not yet ready to let a black woman inhabit its highest shelves. She moved through towns, train stations, lecture halls, and salt-splash docks, always carrying a small bundle of tools, a steady hand, exact notes, and a stubborn appetite to know. The next season would bring a tighter test of those tools, a summer at Woods Hole that would change how she saw herself and how others began to see her. On the morning she boarded the train for Woods Hole, she did not know that one meeting there would place her reputation in the hands of a man whose praise was fierce, and whose jealousy could be fiercer. The first morning at Woods Hole felt like stepping into a cathedral of sea, air, and glass, tanks humming, lamps ticking, and the ocean throwing sand against the dock. Roger arrived at the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole with a suitcase and a notebook that already smelled of lamp oil. The place was cooler than the city, and saltier than the stories she had been told. Wooden walkways creaked underfoot. Nets hung like tired flags. In the lab, glass aquaria-lined benches and racks of small bottles caught the light like a row of pale teeth. The sound of water moving in tanks was a slow, regular punctuation to the day. For Roger, who had learned to read small things, the lab felt like a language she had almost known all her life. She worked that summer under the eye of Ernest Everett Just, a towering figure in black science then teaching at Howard University. Just had a way of speaking as if each word were weighed. He valued careful observation and a respect for the living material. He taught graduate students to wait with experiments until cells themselves told you what they would do. Under his guidance, Roger learned to coax eggs from sea urchins and to watch them in the exact moment of fertilization, a quick, bright event that felt like thunder in miniature. The work demanded long patience. Sometimes answers came only after hours of steady watching, when a cell membrane rippled or failed to ripple at all. Woods Hole was also a place of small freedoms and small humiliations. On good days the ocean would hand you a miracle, a perfect lava, a clear mitotic division, a slide that showed something no one else had noticed. On other days, equipment would fail, grants would not arrive, and prejudice would wrap itself around a researcher like a fog. Roger was the first black woman documented to conduct research there. That fact sat with her like both honor and weight. She felt proud to be allowed inside the lab doors, and she knew too that each small success could be misread, minimized, or quietly explained away by colleagues who did not want to believe a black woman could lead in science. Her hands learned the languages of seawater and glass. She learned the particular art of letting plates settle so that eggs did not shatter under movement. She learned to listen, really listen, to the soft tick of a culturing incubator and the faint sigh of a pipette. Those sensory details are small, but they built her confidence. There were moments of triumph, a slide that showed a clear pattern, a grant approved, a mentor's nod. There were also moments of exhaustion, sunburned forearms from long days on the dock, the metallic taste of worry when money ran short, and the quiet dread that came when a trusted colleague's praise slipped into possessiveness. In those summers Roger also began to gather a name for herself in small circles. She presented findings at meetings and helped write grant applications. She worked on problems Ernest just cared about, the hydration and dehydration of eggs, the mechanics of fertilization, and how cells handled salt and radiation. Her work was careful and often quiet. She learned the cruelty that comes when someone's brilliance is useful, but their power to claim it is limited. At times her contributions were acknowledged. At other times they were folded into another's narrative. Those contradictions shaped her resolve. But tenderness and strain lived side by side. Colleagues remembered Roger's soft laugh and her habit of sketching tiny diagrams in the margins of her lab notes. She loved small jokes that eased long days. Yet the lab also left marks. The lamps used in some experiments damaged her eyes, and later accounts suggest she believed her sight was never the same after years of exposure to strong ultraviolet light. The price of those summers included both knowledge and bodily cost. Aside, a small reflective beat mentorship can be a light and a shadow. A teacher can open a door and also, without meaning to on purpose, keep the keys. Roger's summer work taught her the value of deep guidance and the peril of depending too much on another person for access to tools, funding, and reputation. By the end of her first summers at Woods Hole, Roger had a rhythm: collect at dawn, dissect at noon, observe at dusk, write long notes at night. Her notebook became a map of tiny discoveries and questions. She learned to write with the clarity of someone who knew that words on the page were often the only defense against being overlooked. Each experiment was a small argument for her place in science, a proof she could hold up in the language of cells and data. Yet tensions were gathering under that rhythm. The very man who had opened the lab door to her could be fiercely protective and fiercely jealous of credit and authority. Small decisions about equipment access and authorship began to feel like tests of allegiance. Rumors and quiet slights entered the margins of her work like stray grains of sand. She learned how quickly praise could curdle into control, and how an ally in public could limit you in private. The questions she began to ask in her lab notebook were no longer only about cells. They were about safety, independence, and how to keep her own name on her work. One evening, after a day of perfect slides and a long argument over who would present a paper at an upcoming meeting, Roger found a stack of her lab notes missing from her drawer, and the face of her mentor looking colder than it had ever looked before. Praise can be a warm hand, until it tightens and will not let you go. The praise of colleagues tastes sweet at first. For Roger, it came as nods, as invitations to summer work at Woods Hole, and as the soft authority of Ernest Everett Just's approval. She learned to trust that approval the way a sailor trusts a steady lighthouse. The lamps hummed and the benches smelled of salt and paraffin. But the same voice that had opened doors could also, quietly and without ceremony, close them. Things that began as mentorship shifted. Access to equipment narrowed. Decisions about who presented at meetings and whose name would appear on papers no longer felt like neutral, scientific choices. They felt personal. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Roger found herself doing the technical labor that pushed research forward while others, sometimes the same voices that praised her, took the public credit. This was a slow, grinding hum. It peeled at her confidence. The lab, which had once felt like a place of refuge, began to hold tensions like a room holds heat. In those years, the strain mounted. When Just traveled to seek funding and publish, Roger stepped into responsibilities he left behind. She served as acting chair of the Zoology department at Howard. She prepared lectures, graded papers, tended experiments, and kept the department breathing. It should have been an office of achievement. Instead, it became the stage for a painful paradox. Her labor gave just a burst of productivity that led to a record number of publications, but her own name rarely rode the same wave of recognition. She watched notebooks become drafts under another's heading. She watched access to key instruments tighten as if protection of resources required her exclusion. The injustice was not dramatic in a single violent scene. It was a slow, domestic thing, the way doors were closed softly and then locked. Roger did not remain passive. She wrote, quietly and bluntly, to the man who had been her mentor. In a letter dated May 6, 1935, she complained that she was being kept from doing research in the department, and that such treatment was so averse to a true scientific or real university spirit that she could scarcely accept it. Her words show a scientist trying to name the harm with exactness. They also show the courage and the exhaustion of someone who had tried, for years, to be patient and to let her work speak. The response from the institution was not the one she needed. Charges were brought. In 1936, her position at Howard was terminated. The dismissal felt less like the end of a job, and more like an erasure of a portion of her life. There is a smell to loss that lingers, the cold of an office suddenly emptied, the faint residue of formalin on a bench that no longer holds your hands, the rustle of a laboratory ledger you do not open anymore. For Roger, those sensory memories threaded with real consequences. Without the steady institutional backing she had once expected, she faced hard choices about how to continue. Many would have let the hurt extinguish them. Roger chose instead another route. She took the brave, difficult step of leaving the scene of that conflict and pursuing her doctorate elsewhere. In June 1937, she enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania to study under Louis Victor Heilbronn, whom she met during summers at Woods Hole. It was a new laboratory, with new lamps and new faces, but it could not erase the years of cost she had already paid. The years at Penn demanded both rigor and reinvention. Roger returned to the steady work of observation and experiment. She dug into the indirect effects of radiation on marine eggs and the membrane mechanics of fertilization. She wrote with a lean, careful hand. The doctorate she pursued was not merely a degree, it was also an argument, an insistence that, despite earlier exclusions, her work belonged in the official record of science. In 1940, she earned her Ph.D. in zoology. The title made history. She became the first African-American woman awarded a Ph.D. in zoology in the United States. The moment was both triumphant and bittersweet. Triumph for the work accomplished, bitter for the recognition that the path had been littered with avoidable obstacles. Aside, a small reflective beat independence does not mean solitude. Pursuing your own path often involves stepping away from what is familiar. That step can be brave and necessary, but it also asks a cost: the loss of networks, the need to rebuild credibility, and the quiet grief for relationships that have gone cold. Roger's choice to leave Howard and rebuild at Penn shows the strange courage required to reclaim one's own name. Earning the doctorate should have been a key to wider doors. Instead, Roger discovered that many doors in academia remained narrow or firmly closed to a black woman, even with a Ph.D. So she took work where she could find it. She accepted teaching posts that paid less but allowed her to keep a hand in the life of students in classrooms. She moved to institutions that offered fewer research resources, but she continued to teach, mentor, and occasionally find time for experiments. Her life became a balancing act between the laboratory she loved and the realities of an academic world structured against her. She was, by turns, proud, exhausted, angry, and resolute. The doctorate had made her a name on a diploma, but not a guarantee of peace. In the coming years, she would trade the bright lamps of research for the small, fierce world of classroom chalk and community organizing, and she would step into fights that were far from the microscope. A diploma can open a door, but it does not change the weather on the street you must walk home on. After the Ph.D., Roger Arliner Young carried her degree like a small, heavy lantern. She had earned a name that belonged to her, in black ink on parchment. The letters looked bright and final. Yet the world that waited beyond the ceremony was the same weather-beaten world she had learned to navigate: classrooms with chalk dust in the air, laboratories with more need than gear, committees that spoke kindly and then quietly steered grants elsewhere. The smell of formalin and the warm click of slides under a cover slip were constant comforts. They reminded her that knowledge itself was steady, whether or not the world handed credit fairly. She moved through towns and campuses, teaching where she could, lecturing where doors would open for a day, and taking on any job that let her keep a laboratory bench or a classroom full of curious faces. Her teaching mattered to students. In small rooms with cheap chalk and thin seating, she showed young men and women not only how to pipette or stain, but how to look. She taught them to notice the shimmer at the edge of a cell membrane, the irregular beat of a protist, or the way eggs responded to salt. Her voice in the classroom was plain and exact. She preferred clear sentences and live demonstrations. Students remembered her patience, the way she leaned close to show a slide and then stepped back to give them space to discover. There was humor too. She kept a small box of errant glass slips and would, with a dry smile, tell a story about a time a slide misbehaved, and the room would relax into laughter. Those moments were triumphs she could hold in her hands. Outside class, the world could be unkind. Funding was scarce and bias was abundant. Sometimes applications for research money were returned without comment. Once promising collaborations dimmed when other names were put forward. The physical toll of years under strong laboratory lamps, the ultraviolet light used in some experiments, left her with complaints about her eyesight. Whether the damage was direct or cumulative, she felt the chill of losing something vital to a scientist, the sharpness with which the world presents itself. There were also personal strains. Health worries in her family, the grinding insecurity of paychecks that did not cover all the bills, and the loneliness that comes when colleagues accept a familiar injustice as ordinary. She learned to be stubborn in small ways, to save money where she could, to trade duties with a friend, to accept a student assistant who became both help and companion through hard months. Her reputation as a careful experimentalist and a rigorous observer kept some doors open. She published intermittently, contributed to meetings, and continued to teach. Yet the pattern of small victories mixed with larger setbacks hardened into a rhythm, a lecture contract here, a summer fellowship there, followed by months of scraping together work. At times she found steady employment at institutions that valued her teaching more than her research. Those places gave her rooms full of young faces and questions that brightened even the dullest months. She loved those classrooms because they were immediate. A student's sudden and delighted gasp at seeing a division under the microscope was a kind of sunlight. There were darker stretches. Over time, stresses accumulated and shadowed her days. Colleagues later recalled periods when she struggled with mental distress and instability. There were episodes that led to hospital care and to periods out of active professional life. Memory and records show a woman who, despite real achievements, faced fragile supports and an indifferent academic system. It is a painful reminder that talent and degrees do not guarantee safety nets. In those years she experienced both neglect and small kindnesses, friends who brought soup, students who sat with her, and a few administrators who tried to help where they could. Aside, a small reflective beat worth is not only measured by publication counts or podium time. It is also the small teacher who explains a tricky principle until a single student lights up, the steady hand that shows how to set a slide, the quiet courage to return to work after a setback. Roger's life taught that these acts are themselves science, and they are themselves legacy. Toward the end of her life, the public narrative around her grew quieter even as the facts of her place in history remained undisputed among those who had followed her work. She lived with the ache of what could have been research programs that might have flourished with support, experiments that might have been published with full credit, and a wider recognition that took decades to come. Yet she also left behind living traces. Students who remembered her rigor, notebooks that still held sharp observations, and a scientific lineage that tied her to the practice of careful, patient study of life at its smallest scales. The textures of that life, the salt on her lab bench from a summer at Woods Hole, the smell of formalin, the chalk dust on a lecture hand, are the same small sensory keepsakes that mean most in a scientist's story. Her final years were quiet in the public eye. She died in 1964, an ending that felt both solitary and tethered to the many hands she had guided. The world would take time to recognize her fully. Later generations would discover her papers, retell her story, and name fellowships in her honor. For Roger herself, those later honors were not the immediate comfort she needed. In the end, she left a mixed ledger, hard-bought achievements, a roster of students and colleagues changed by her teaching, and the stubborn fact that a black woman had carved a place in zoology at a time when such a step was almost impossible. The story of how she was remembered, the honors, the erasures, and the eventual reclamation of her name, would begin only after her death, when other hands began to turn back the pages of scientific history and notice what had been missing. She carried a microscope like a small, stubborn lamp, bright enough to guide others, but not to warm all the rooms she passed through. After her Ph.D., Roger Arliner Young moved between classrooms and community rooms as if tying together two lives that the world kept insisting should not belong to the same woman. She taught at North Carolina College for Negroes and Shaw University, where the chalk on her fingers and the smell of lab alcohol were as familiar as the creak of worn floorboards. Students crowded close to her demonstrations, leaning forward when she held up a slide and tracing the tiny, living motion with their eyes. Those small, immediate wins, a student's sudden gasp at seeing mitosis, the quiet pride after a lab finally worked, were lifelines. They were also the visible work that made the less visible costs harder to ignore, lower pay than many white peers, classrooms that doubled as makeshift labs, and a constant thinness of resources outside the lecture halls. Roger's life swelled into civic action. She refused to accept the idea that a scientist could be separated from the life of her community. She joined the NAACP's Durham chapter and took a post on the board of the Harriet Tubman YWCA. When tobacco workers in North Carolina sought someone to speak for them, she stepped forward, organizing and listening in equal measure. Her voice had a plain clarity. She did not need to raise it loudly to be heard. The facts she offered, about wages, about conditions, about simple human dignity, carried weight. At the time, these choices were risky. Being publicly visible in labor and civil rights struggles invited scrutiny from police, employers, and judges who upheld the status quo. She understood the danger, but she walked into it anyway because the same stubborn insistence that pushed her to keep a stubborn lab also pushed her to stand with workers and neighbors. One cold July day in 1946, that insistence led her onto a bus where the rules of the road were painfully clear and brutally enforced. Traveling to a meeting with tobacco workers, she refused to give up her seat for a white man. The bus driver called the police. She was dragged from the vehicle and taken to jail. Roger refused to apologize to have the charges dropped. The episode was not merely a headline. It was a sensory scene that would stay with her. The scrape of the metal bench against her back, the sour tang of fear in the air, the metallic clack of a cell door. It was also a public demonstration of a principle, that dignity and science were not separate spheres for her. She taught in classrooms and pressed for justice outside them. That refusal echoed the small bravery of many of her scientific acts, to stand by observation and the truth it revealed, even when others denied it. The years that followed wove triumph and strain into a single braid. She continued to publish and to teach, moving between institutions, from Howard earlier in her career to Shaw, then to appointments at Bishop College, Paul Quinn University, and later Jackson State University. Each new post brought fresh students and new small victories, but also fresh instability, transient pay, limited lab access, and the ever-present shadow of discrimination. She loved teaching because it was immediate. Unlike grant panels and journal committees, a classroom answered you back. Yet the lack of stable institutional support for research left her with pieces of projects and half-finished curiosity. She kept notebooks like people keep diaries, recording observations that felt like small treasures and warnings about how easily credit evaporated when one's name did not fit the expected mold. There were deeper costs, too. Years of intense laboratory light, long hours, financial stress, and the burden of caregiving for her ailing mother took their toll. Biographers and archival records point to periods of serious mental health struggles in the 1950s. She hospitalized herself at times and spent stretches with limited professional activity. Accounts differ on specifics, but the pattern is clear. A gifted scientist who faced illness with the inadequate social supports of her era, and who, like many who don't fit the system's favored profile, fell into gaps where help was scarce. Friends, students, and a few colleagues tried to provide aid and company. Their kindnesses were small comforts against a larger tide of neglect. Aside, institutions often mistake quiet suffering for private failure, a lesson about how systems, not people, need better care. Even as the years narrowed in, Roger kept a fierce practice of curiosity. She continued to write and to teach where she could. Her experiments on sea urchin eggs, membrane hydration, and the excretory structures of protists remain present in the notebooks scholars later consulted. She never married. Her life's loves were students, organisms under a cover slip, and the small political fights that reminded her that science and justice can be tied together. In 1953 her mother died. That loss shifted her world. Later professional years would be quieter, and by the early 1960s her public profile had dimmed. Still, she died in November 1964, at Charité Hospital in New Orleans, leaving behind papers, memories, and an unsettled ledger of what she had given and what had been given back. Her immediate passing did not close her story. Over time, historians, biographers, and activists began to turn back through archives and to notice gaps in the narrative of American science. They found her science paper from 1924, her doctoral dissertation, and the letters that showed both her talent and the obstacles she faced. Communities and institutions began to honor her name. A Marine Conservation Fellowship was created in her honor to support young black people in marine science, and in 2005 Congress named her among a group of women honored for breaking barriers in science. These gestures could not change the rough years she endured, but they began the slow walk of correction, acknowledging the cost of exclusion and celebrating the steadiness of a woman who kept her lamp lit through storms. Her story might have been a quiet footnote, but a new generation of scholars opened the boxes, read the notebooks, and found questions that no one had yet answered. Questions that would lead to a re-examination of credit, memory, and how science remembers those who do the work. What they discovered next would change how the field told its own history. A name folded into old boxes can be louder than a podium if someone opens the box and listens. Years after her last lamp had cooled and her bench had been cleared, quiet hands began to open the boxes that held Roger Arliner Young's life, notebooks with margins full of tiny diagrams, letters browned at the edges, reprints with penciled comments, and a few photographs that showed a woman whose smile was quick and private. Archivists and young historians found these artifacts not because a single crowd demanded it, but because a handful of people refused to let her work vanish into the general fog of forgotten names. They read the pages the way Roger had read slides, slowly, with attention to the small movements that signaled something larger. The rediscovery did not happen as a single bright event. It arrived the way a tide returns, gradually, insistently, and with a pull that rearranges the shoreline. They found the 1924 paper in Science tucked beside correspondence. They found letters that spoke of exclusion as plainly as they spoke of experiments. They found in the margins the impatience of a scientist who wanted to be named for what she had done. These discoveries sparked essays, lectures, and a renewed interest among younger black scientists who wanted to know the shoulders on which they stood. The sensory details of this phase were oddly domestic. The smell of old paper, the clack of a scanner, the soft fluorescent light of a reading room, and the sudden, sharp joy when a line in a notebook connected a method to a name. Aside, memory is a craft as much as a moral act. It requires people willing to look, to keep, and to speak. As scholars published new accounts, the story of Young's life moved outward from specialized journals into public conversation. Small commemorations appeared. Symposium talks, museum displays, and college seminars that introduced her to students who had never heard her name. Her life became a case study in both the ingenuity of marginalized scientists and the systems that make that ingenuity invisible. 4 young black students in marine science. Her notes on sea urchin eggs and membrane behavior were no longer obscure relics, but living examples that their curiosity had roots deep in the past. Faculty who had never thought to teach about race and science began to include her story in syllabi. Grant panels and fellowship committees, slowly, haltingly, began to speak about the costs of exclusion and the need to support those who had been left out. People who had once accepted a narrow canon of scientific heroes found themselves widening the frame. Places and people outside the hubs of privilege had long been shaping the story of how we know the living world. Recognition came in fits. Some institutions created modest honors and named lectures in her memory. A few fellowships and awards were launched to support underrepresented students in marine and life sciences, gestures that attempted to address the very gaps that had shaped her career. These moves were never enough to erase decades of missed opportunity, but they did something necessary. They made her name a tool for change, not only a footnote in a book. The emotional tone of this period was mixed. There was joy, real and loud, when a student read one of her papers aloud in a seminar and realized how original her methods were. There was also anger and sorrow, especially among older colleagues who had known the quieter parts of her story and felt how long the redress had taken. For some, the corrections of history felt belated. For others, they were a source of hope that systems could be nudged, if only a little, toward justice. Her notebooks themselves began to be read as an invitation rather than a closed chapter. Young experiments recorded in shorthand suggested follow-up questions, small, precise curiosities that contemporary researchers could revisit with modern tools. In a way that Roger would likely have appreciated, her old queries about membrane behavior and cellular hydration sounded like open doors rather than sealed epitaphs. Young scientists began to build projects that acknowledged her work explicitly, citing her papers and including historical notes in their proposals. These gestures were both symbolic and practical. By naming her, they restored a lineage and widened the intellectual community that could trace a thread from past observations to future discovery. The sensory image here is oddly satisfying. A new pipette tip, a clean slide, and an experiment begun with a quotation from a woman who had once written in the margins. Yet the recovery of her story also forced an uncomfortable accounting. Historians and scientists debated how much of her work had been absorbed by others without credit, how mentorship could shade into control, and what institutions owed those who had been used and then displaced. Universities examined personnel files and correspondence. Museum curators reconsidered which faces and names they displayed. Philanthropists were asked to do more than name a room. They were asked to fund sustained support for the scholars who follow. The larger lesson that emerged was clear. Honoring a single figure without changing the structures that led to their marginalization is incomplete. Commemoration must walk alongside concrete investment in education, access, and research infrastructure. In classrooms and conferences today, Roger Arliner Young is no longer merely an interesting side-by. She is a conversation starter about mentorship, about the ethics of credit, and about the human costs of scientific labor. Her life, its sharp early achievements, its long stretches of struggle, its late recovery by historians, offers a textured lesson. Each scientist carries private histories, and those histories shape what gets studied, funded, and remembered. But perhaps the most vivid part of her afterlife is this. In a small coastal lab, a graduate student once traced a faint penciled note in her thesis and, inspired, designed an experiment that answered a question Roger had left half-asked. The results were modest, but they mattered. They closed a tiny loop between past and present and made the act of remembrance itself a kind of continuing experiment. When scholars kept turning pages, they found one final set of notes, a sketch of an experiment that never made it to publication, with a question at the top that read like a day. A young scientist would soon stand at that bench and have to decide, repeat what was tried, or push the question into an entirely new direction. Names come back to life when someone opens the box and reads the handwriting. After archivists and historians pulled Roger Arliner Young's notes into the light, the ripple moved fast and slow at once. People read her cramped lab entries and felt something like recognition. They found the 1924 science note in her 1940 dissertation, and they placed those items beside letters that spoke plainly about exclusion. Scholars wrote articles that asked not just who she was, but how her work had been folded into other careers and why her name had not been shouted from more rooftops sooner. This renewed attention did not erase the hard years she had lived, but it did begin to change the conversation about what counts as scientific legacy and who gets remembered for doing the work. Institutions took small but visible steps. A congressional resolution in 2005 named Roger Arliner Young along with other black women scientists as pioneers who had broken through many barriers. That public acknowledgement was more than a line in a record. It was a formal recognition from a national body that history had left gaps and that those gaps mattered. The resolution sent a message. The story of American science is incomplete without the people it quietly pushed to the margins. For many who had labored in silence, the resolution felt like a belated public nod to endurance. Practical change followed symbolic change. New fellowship programs and named initiatives began to appear that used her name as a banner for access and training. The Dr. Roger Arliner Young Ray Fellowship, for example, started to place early career fellows into conservation and clean energy roles while explicitly connecting the fellowship's mission to Young's legacy of persistence and scientific curiosity. These programs are not simple reparations. They do not rewrite the years she spent fighting for recognition. But they do something necessary. They create opportunities and pathways that were scarce in her day. For students who hear her name now, the Ray Fellowship is both a tribute and a practical ladder to work in fields she loved. Classrooms changed too. Professors began to assign her papers and to tell her story alongside other histories of science. Where once syllabi held a narrow list of canonical figures, courses now sometimes include case studies about the politics of credit and mentorship. Young's life became a classroom tool for teaching students not only cell biology, but also the ethics of research, who authors a paper, who gets the grant, and how power shapes what becomes discoverable. The change was small and uneven. Not every department altered its curricula. But in places where students once learned only a single lineage of discovery, they now hear a second, overlapping story, one that includes people who worked in smaller labs, in quieter ways, and who nevertheless moved the field forward. For practicing scientists, Young's notebooks offered usable questions. Her notes about membrane hydration, fertilization mechanics, and protist anatomy read like invitations. Modern labs, armed with better imaging and molecular tools, found in her quick sketches the seeds of experiments that could now be done more fully. In some labs, her margin notes translated directly into pilot studies. Graduate students described the sensation of standing at a bench, reading one of Young's entries, and feeling the line between past curiosity and present method. That bridge is one of the most literal forms of legacy, a paper left half-assed that a later hand completes. There were arguments as well as celebrations. The renewed attention forced uncomfortable questions. How much of Young's labor had been used by others without credit? How did mentorship sometimes morph into appropriation? Historians, ethicists, and scientists debated institutional responsibilities. Some urged universities to fund archival work and student support. Others pushed for name chairs and long-term fellowships instead of one-off lectures. The debate mattered because honoring a single body without changing structural conditions is only partial repair. Memory without investment can feel like a label on an empty room. Emotion ran through all of this. For former students and a few surviving colleagues, the recognition sparked both warmth and sorrow. Warmth, because some small justice was finally being spoken aloud. Sorrow, because the honors came decades after needs were acute and immediate. For young black scientists today, the story of Roger Arliner Young offered both a mirror and a map. They saw in her patience and precision a model to admire. They also saw the cost of persistence when systems fail to protect talent. That double-edged lesson, how to hold both pride and realism at once, is perhaps the clearest inheritance she left. Aside, a small reflective beat remembering someone is not only about praise. It is also about asking what we will do differently now. If a name resurfaces in a book or plaque, let it be the start of policies that widen access to resources, mentorship, and real career support. Today her name is stitched into fellowships, syllabi, and conference talks. It is also a question. When historians found a fragment of an experiment she sketched but never published, the note read like a day. A young scientist in a coastal lab decided to take it up. She prepared an experiment that used modern fluorescence imaging to test an idea Young had only been able to observe with crude lamps. The work was small in scope but large in symbolism, a modern instrument answering a historical question. In that benchwork, the act of tribute became active research, and the field learned not only about cells but about how knowledge travels, pauses, and sometimes waits for someone to come back. Cliffhanger. The young scientist primed her slides, dimmed the lamp, and placed Young's penciled question at the top of a notebook. When the first images appeared on the screen, they showed something neither paper nor legend had predicted, and it would pull more researchers into a conversation about how discoveries are claimed, credited, and continued. When a forgotten name begins to appear on posters, fellowships, and syllabi, history exhales, and a whole new argument about justice begins. The world that had once brushed Roger Arliner Young aside began, slowly, to brush back. Her 1924 note in Science, a small, clear paper about the excretory apparatus in paramecium, was no longer a footnote a few scholars knew. It became a cited starting point in talks about early black contributions to biology. That short page in an old journal carried a sound like a bell. Someone had been here before us, writing carefully, seeing clearly. Scholars pointed to it as evidence that her scientific voice had spoken early and with authority. The formal acknowledgments followed. In 2005, Congress passed a resolution that named her among pioneering African American women in science, publicly recognizing that barriers had kept people like Young out of the story for too long. For many, this felt like a small, but official, correction, a moment when the state said, aloud, that the history we had been taught left things out. The paper resolution could not rewrite decades of a difficult career, but it did place a name into the ledger of national memory. Naming carried practical consequences too. The Dr. Roger Arliner Young, Ray, Fellowship took her name and turned it into a ladder for others. The program places recent graduates into conservation and clean energy work, pairing training with paid experience and mentors. When a fellowship bears your name, that name performs two acts. It honors the person, and it invests in the future people who might follow a similar path. For students who today learn of Young because of a fellowship logo on an application page, the legacy is no longer a retrospective consolation. It is a present opportunity. Recognition on paper and programs was one part of the story. Classrooms changed in small ways that felt intimate and true. Professors who once taught a narrow set of canonical figures began assigning Young's papers. Students saw, under fluorescent lights and in crowded lab rooms, that the history of discovery had been more diverse than they had learned. That shift carried practical value. It reframed whose questions get asked, whose methods are studied, and which archives are worth opening. Young's notebooks, once tucked into boxes, now functioned as prompts for new experiments and new lines of inquiry. Emotion ran through the rediscovery like a current. For some former students or colleagues who had known her, public recognition felt like a delayed hand on a shoulder, warm but late. They remembered the smell of the lab, the rasp of chalk on board, the cautious good humor Roger carried through shortages and slights. For younger scientists, the rediscovery brought a sharper feeling, relief and rage mixed together. Relief that a lineage was being acknowledged, rage that the system had made such recognition necessary only after decades. That contradictory mix animates many modern conversations about equity in science, gratitude for correction, and impatience that it took so long. Institutions also faced harder questions. It is easy to hang a plaque and call it progress. It is harder to rework hiring practices, to fund sustained research pipelines for historically excluded scholars, or to change who sits on review panels. Scholars and activists used Young's story as a lever. If a woman with a science paper and a Ph.D. could be sidelined, what does that say about how credit and access are structured? Those conversations led to proposals, more archival work to uncover hidden contributions, more sustained funding for underrepresented researchers, and curricular changes that refused to flatten history into a single triumphant arc. The question shifted from did she deserve remembrance to what structural change will remembrance trigger? There were also debates about narrative and nuance. Some writers cautioned against turning Young into either a saint or victim. Her career had joy, comic relief, stubborn ingenuity, and also real hardship, including episodes of mental health struggles and institutional neglect. To tell her story honestly required holding both celebration and sorrow at once. That duality is part of the real story. Triumph intertwined with cost, discovery braided with erasure. When historians and teachers placed her life in classrooms, they tried to keep that balance, showing her methods and her humanity together. Aside, a small reflective beat honoring the past is not finished when a plaque is set. Memory must be actionable. Naming someone is a start. Funding, mentoring, and changing policy are the follow-through. Otherwise, the tribute becomes a tidy artifact, not a lever. Today her name moves through three circles: the archival, old notebooks and correspondence, the institutional, fellowships, syllabi, resolutions, and the experimental, researchers who read her margins and pick up a question. Each circle changes the other. A fellowship introduces a student to her papers. A paper prompts an experiment that cites her. An experiment generates results that deepen our respect for the observations she left behind. That active triangle, memory feeding practice, practice reshaping memory, is perhaps the most alive part of her legacy. But questions remained. Who had been credited for what in the old lab notebooks? Which unsent letters might show the full shape of decisions that pushed her out? Scholars were already opening files, reading margins, and drafting articles. The next part of the story will sit in those letters and notebooks, and in the small, precise claims about credit that can change how we name scientific achievement. Truth shows up in small places: a penciled margin, a folded letter, a faded photograph, and sometimes those small things start an argument louder than any podium. When historians and scientists began to read Roger Arliner Young's life closely, they found more than a tidy story of triumph and setback. They found a knot of small dramas that asked hard questions about credit, care, and memory. Her notebooks, once tucked away and nearly lost, showed methods written in careful shorthand, experiments begun and abandoned, and notes that sighed with frustration when doors closed. There were letters from colleagues that praised her work in private, and then public documents that credited it elsewhere. The gap between private praise and public recognition felt, to many who read the files, like a pattern rather than an accident. That discovery shifted the conversation from a single tale of one woman's courage to a broader inquiry. How often have the hands that turn the wheels of research been left unnamed? Those archival finds carried the smell of dust and paper and the small tremor of a scanner slowly copying faded ink. Reading them was a sensory kind of justice, slow, careful, and strangely intimate. As scholars published essays and gave talks, the findings sparked debates in journals and conference panels. Some argued that Young's case was typical of an era when record-keeping and authorship norms were loose and often unfair to those with less power. Others insisted the pattern revealed deeper structural flaws: mentorship that veered into appropriation, institutions that rewarded some faces and not others, and funding channels that preferred comfortable reputations over new talent. These arguments were not only academic. They moved hiring committees to ask new questions, prompted archival projects that sought other hidden names, and nudged some journals to clarify authorship policies. For students reading about Young for the first time, the details felt personal. They saw how a single lost notebook entry could be the hinge that changes a career's public memory, and they felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. At the same time, the recovery of her work created practical ripples. Grants and fellowships named for her began to place young scientists into labs and fieldwork, and some of those early recipients reported a private thrill at holding a copy of Young's 1924 note in Science while planning an experiment of their own. Those small acts of naming mattered because they turned remembrance into opportunity. Yet naming without action was not enough. Critics reminded institutions that a plaque or fellowship cannot undo years of exclusion. What was needed was sustained investment, better mentorship, and real seats at decision-making tables. Aside, honoring someone's name is meaningful, but it must be followed by structural changes that prevent the same harms from happening again. Emotion threaded through all of this. Older scientists who had once known Young or her students spoke at memorials with voices that cracked between pride and regret. Younger scholars used her story in classrooms to teach not only cell biology, but also the ethics of lab work and the politics of authorship. Families and community members who had kept letters and photos found, sometimes with surprise, that their quiet archives had value beyond personal memory. Their attics became part of a public history. The debates were sometimes messy. Some historians worried about overclaiming causal links between specific acts of exclusion and broader patterns, without careful evidence. Others pushed back against the sanitizing impulse to present Young as only a victim or only a hero. They insisted on telling a full human story with humor and sorrow, small triumphs and public pain. Through these conversations, a new norm slowly emerged in some corners of science. Cite the work you used, name the people who contributed, and make lab note archives accessible for future historians. Those changes were small at first, a few journals tightening authorship rules, a couple of universities funding archival fellows, but they signaled a shift in how scientific communities think about fairness. Outside the academy, Young's life became a language for activists and teachers. Civil rights groups pointed to her bus arrest as evidence that the same moral courage that drives a scientist can also make one visible in political struggles. Educators used her story to show students that science is not only about discovery, but also about who gets to ask questions and who gets to be heard. That broader cultural framing helped non-academic audiences understand why redressing the past matters for current policy. When we miss or silence contributors, we lose not only names, but also the diversity of questions and perspectives that lead to better science. Still, for all the progress in memory and policy, there remained unanswered things in the boxes. Notes for experiments never completed, drafts of lectures that stopped mid-sentence, and letters that hinted at conversations that had not been fully recorded. Those loose ends continued to invite researchers back to the archives and to the benches. Young's story had become, paradoxically, both a closed chapter and an open invitation. The more people read her margins, the more they saw that her life was not an isolated oddity, but a pattern that asked accountability. That realization would lead a new generation to try something different, not merely to name forgotten figures, but to change the daily practices of labs so that the next Roger Arliner Young would not have to fight for recognition in the margins. The final episode will tie these threads together, the personal, the political, and the practical, and ask what a true reckoning with Roger's life would look like in the day-to-day life of a modern lab, a university, and a society that still honors some names but leaves others to be found. The ledger of a life is never only numbers on a page. It is the small, bright record of who stayed, who left, and who kept showing up when the world told them to go. Roger Arliner Young's life ends on paper with a neat date, November 9, 1964, but it does not end in the quiet way a single line might suggest. Her story keeps moving because people kept reading her margins, because students remembered the warmth of her small jokes, and because modern hands turned old pages and found questions that had been left half-asked. In the years after her death, historians, teachers, and activists slowly braided her memory into a broader account of American science. That folding in did not rewrite the hard years she lived through. It only made visible the long arc between solitary benchwork and public recognition, between the small lamp on a lab bench and the floodlight of institutional change. The texture of the final chapter is not one of tidy justice, but of continuing work. Fellowships that bear her name, syllabi that teach her papers, and experiments that pick up where she stopped. These are not mere honors. They are tools that turn remembrance into forward motion. There is a quiet poetry to the things she left, a slender stack of reprints, the margins full of pencil notes, the single line in Science from 1924 that proves a mind already at work. Those objects are sensory anchors, the smell of old paper, The thin scratch of pencil on a brittle page, the weight of a dissertation bound in plain cloth. Students and scholars who touch those items report an odd intimacy, as if the act of reading across a century forms a conversation between breaths. That intimacy is not sentimental. It is practical. When a graduate student reads her shorthand about membrane behavior and then designs a fluorescent imaging experiment, the act is both homage and science. Roger's observations become data points in new studies. Her questions start experiments that yield images, charts, and peer-reviewed papers. The loop closes in a small, tangible way. The past nudges the present, and the present answers. Her life also leaves an ethical ledger. The letters that document praise given privately but withheld publicly force institutions and individuals to ask hard questions. Who gets authorship? Who gets credit? Who decides who will speak at a meeting? These are not old-fashioned queries. They are the everyday machinery of a field. The recovery of her story pushed journals to clarify authorship standards and prompted graduate programs to teach the ethics of collaboration. It also spurred a practical reckoning among funders and university administrators who began, in some places, to fund archives and to create structured support for scholars from underrepresented backgrounds. Those steps are small and uneven, but they are the kind of repair that changes the day-to-day experience of a young scientist, a person who might otherwise learn too late that saying "I did this" can be dangerous when the system favors other voices. Aside, justice is not a single act. It is a series of small, consistent corrections, hiring practices, mentorship training, and funding that lasts longer than a headline. Emotion runs through the final appraisal of her life like a low, steady chord. There is pride in the Ph.D. that announced her arrival in an era that rarely welcomed people who looked like her, in the students who still speak of her lessons as if they were gifts, in the modern scientists who found in her pen a question they could answer. There is sorrow for the experiments that were never finished, for the summers that exacted physical tolls, for the years of inadequate pay and the seasons in which loneliness and illness closed in. There is anger too, and that anger is useful. It sharpens policy and points toward change. But perhaps the most complex emotion is tenderness, the sense that a life spent in patient observation is itself a kind of love. Roger loved small living things with an attentiveness that translated into careful work and into the way she taught others to see. That tenderness makes her story intimate and human, not simply heroic or tragic. What does a true reckoning with Roger Arliner Young look like in practice? It means teaching her papers alongside the usual canon, yes. It means funding students whose families cannot afford unpaid summers in labs. It means teaching mentorship as a skill that includes accountability. It means making archives accessible and ensuring that authorship and credit are discussed openly in research groups before problems arise. It means that a fellowship bearing her name does not merely decorate a resume, but provides sustained mentorship, community, and pathways to independent research. Those are the daily shifts that would honor her most honestly. They are the small institutional practices that would have mattered most when she was alive. In the end, Roger's life asks a persistent question rather than offering a final answer. What do we do with a name that returns to us from the margins? Do we let it become a plaque, a once-a-year lecture, and then forget? Or do we let it change how we run labs, fund students, and tell our histories? The best of the responses so far has been practical and ongoing. Programs that train early career scientists, curricula that include previously erased voices, and a slow tightening of ethics around credit and authorship. These are not perfect. Progress is uneven. But they are the kinds of things that make a real difference in someone's day-to-day life at the bench. If the work of memory is not finished, then each reader of her notebooks becomes part scientist, part steward. And the real question now is who among us will take up the small, steady labor of changing institutions so that the next Roger Arliner Young never has to fight for the name on her own lab notebook.